The House of Commons did not feel like a place of debate that day. It felt like a pressure chamber moments before rupture. Conversations hushed. Eyes tracked the movement across the benches. There was a sense that something dangerous was about to be said out loud. And when Lee Anderson stood up, there was no easing into it. No warm introduction, no polite camouflage. What followed landed like a blunt instrument swung with intent. He spoke as if the chamber no longer mattered, as if the real audience was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere beyond Westminster, somewhere angrier. He told them that across Britain, in towns and cities far from this building, people were saying one word to him again and again. Sorry. Sorry for believing. Sorry for trusting. Sorry for voting Labour. He said it without hesitation, without softening it, and the reaction in the room was immediate, heads shaking, forced smiles, but the damage was already done. He framed it not as opinion, but as confession. A national admission of regret. And then he pushed further. He said those same people told him they would never make that mistake again, that they wanted the clock turned back, that they wanted a different future, a different voice, and as he spoke, the implication grew heavier. This wasn't about one election. This was about legitimacy itself. The temperature rose fast. Anderson mocked the idea that Labour still had moral authority. He painted their future in stark terms, not leadership, not power, job centres, redundancy, irrelevance. He said many of them would struggle to find work at all because their record spoke louder than any CV ever could. The chamber reacted, but he didn't slow down. He accelerated. He accused them of stripping people of their dignity, one policy at a time, of reaching into homes and taking what families had worked for, of justifying it with speeches while ordinary lives were squeezed tighter every month. He said forgiveness was not coming. That memory would not fade. That this moment would follow them long after the cameras stopped rolling. And then he did something deliberate. He asked them to imagine their reckoning. Sitting across from an advisor, being asked what they had done. And he answered for them. He described a government that had lost control of its borders, its streets, its priorities. A country dirtier, poorer, angrier. A leadership that promised order and delivered chaos. The imagery was vivid and unflinching, and it landed exactly where it was meant to. By the time Anderson finished, the speech had already escaped the room. Clips spread before MPs had even left their seats. Millions watched it unfold on their phones within minutes. It was shared, dissected, celebrated, condemned. And as the views climbed, the narrative hardened. This was not just another parliamentary outburst. This was a line being crossed, because what followed made the moment more dangerous. Anderson did not retreat. He doubled down. He refused to apologize. And supporters framed his words not as extremism, but as honesty finally breaking through. For many watching at home, the speech didn't feel shocking. It felt familiar, like someone had finally said what they had been muttering under their breath for years. And while Westminster scrambled to respond, the ground outside was already shifting. Discontent was no longer confined to comments sections and opinion polls. It was rolling on tires and steel. Tractors began appearing where they weren't supposed to be. Roads slowed. Cities felt the weight of rural anger pressing inward. The farming community had reached a breaking point. For generations, land had been more than property. It was inheritance, identity, obligation. Families didn't measure wealth in liquid cash, but in fields passed down with calloused hands and quiet promises. And then the rules changed. A tax framed as fairness landed like a death sentence to people who were asset-rich and cash-poor. On paper, they looked wealthy. In reality, they were one bad harvest away from collapse. What began as meetings became convoys. What began as letters became blockades. Farmers brought their children, their machines, their grief. They said this wasn't about greed. It was about survival. About whether the land they worked would still be theirs to pass on, or whether it would be carved up to pay a bill delivered at death. Ministers dismissed the outrage at first, said the numbers were small, said the fears were exaggerated. But the protests didn't fade. They multiplied. Distribution centers slowed. City centers filled with engines and banners. And every delay, every shrug, every carefully worded statement only deepened the wound. Because this anger wasn't isolated. It was converging. Pensioners, workers, farmers, online communities, all feeding into the same conclusion: that the people in charge no longer understood the people they governed. And that was the space Lee Anderson had stepped into so confidently. But even as domestic pressure mounted, another front was opening. One that would drag Britain into a conflict far beyond its borders. A conflict involving power, technology, speech, and one of the most influential men on the planet. And this time, the Prime Minister wouldn't be facing protesters with tractors. He would be facing Elon Musk. It began with a message that felt almost casual, almost careless. A few words posted online, visible to millions in seconds, questioning whether Britain was still a place where people could speak freely without punishment. It didn't come from a rival politician or a protest group. It came from a man whose platforms shape global conversation, whose companies sit at the intersection of power, technology, and influence. And once it was out there, it couldn't be contained. The government tried to respond with composure. Statements were drafted. Language was softened. But the damage was already done, because this wasn't just criticism. It was a spotlight. And under that light, every unresolved tension inside the country became impossible to ignore. Musk's words acted like a trigger, pulling all the buried frustrations into the open at once. Online, the reaction was immediate and vicious. Clips of arrests, censorship debates, and contradictory government messaging were stitched together and shared at speed. People who had never cared about British politics suddenly had an opinion. Commentators abroad framed the country as a warning, not a model. And inside the UK, something darker took hold. The sense that Britain was being judged, not by enemies, but by the world it once lectured. The Prime Minister attempted to brush it aside. He insisted the country remained free, fair, and lawful. But every denial only invited more scrutiny. Past cases resurfaced. Inconsistencies were replayed. The narrative shifted from defense to disbelief. And once that happens, control slips fast. Meanwhile, Lee Anderson's refusal to apologize began to look less like stubbornness and more like strategy. His supporters framed him as the embodiment of resistance, someone immune to the rituals of retreat and regret. Every attack against him strengthened that image. Every demand for contrition became proof, in their eyes, that he had struck a nerve. Reform UK seized the moment, not with policy documents or detailed plans, but with tone, with posture, with the suggestion that they alone were willing to say the things others danced around. They positioned themselves not as architects of the future, but as the voice of accumulated frustration. And it worked. Poll numbers shifted. Conversations changed. People who had never voted outside the main parties began to consider it. What terrified Westminster wasn't the numbers, it was the momentum. Because momentum doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for approval. It moves, gathers, feeds on reaction. and the government found itself constantly responding, never leading, each crisis overlapping the next. Speech, taxes, protests, international embarrassment, none resolved, all compounding. The country began to feel like it was vibrating under strain. News cycles blurred together, a sense of permanent emergency settled in. And through it all, trust eroded. Not in one dramatic collapse, but in a steady, grinding way. The kind that leaves institutions standing but hollow. In rural areas, protests continued. In cities, debates grew sharper. Families argued at dinner tables. Colleagues stopped discussing politics altogether. The divide wasn't left and right anymore. It was establishment and everyone else. And the longer that divide stayed open, the harder it became to bridge. The Prime Minister spoke of stability, of responsibility, of patience. But patience is a luxury when people feel unheard, when they feel mocked, when they feel their future is being negotiated without them in the room. And every time the government spoke down instead of listening, it confirmed the very accusations it tried to deny. This was no longer about Lee Anderson, or farmers, or Elon Musk. It was about something deeper. A question hanging over the country like a storm cloud. Who is Britain for now? Who decides? And what happens when too many people conclude that the answer doesn't include them? The institutions remained intact. The buildings still stood. The procedures still ran. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The assumption of consent. The quiet agreement that even when people disagreed, the system ultimately worked. That assumption was cracking. And history shows that when that belief goes, change doesn't arrive politely. It arrives through pressure, through confrontation, through moments no one planned but everyone remembers. The speech that day in Parliament wasn't the cause, it was the signal. A flare fired into a sky already heavy with tension. And once people saw it, once they felt it resonate, there was no going back to business as usual. Britain wasn't collapsing. Not yet. But it was awakening to the realization that the old rules no longer held the same power. That voices once dismissed were growing louder. That apologies were no longer enough. And that the next chapter would not be written quietly. It would be written under scrutiny, under resistance, and under the watchful eyes of a public that had stopped waiting for permission to speak.